Hello, and welcome to our presentation, The Essentials of Financial Aid Literacy. My name is Michelle Rizzo. I'm Assistant Director of Financial Aid at Canisius College, and I have been in this field for over 30 years. I hope today to be able to impart some of the information I have learned in those 30 years to make the process of financial aid application a little bit easier for you. Today we're going to be discussing several different topics. We will talk a little bit about some key terms and a general timetable for the application process. We will discuss the main tool for applying for financial aid, which is called the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, or FAFSA. It is used to apply for aid from both the federal student aid programs and for New York State aid programs. We'll touch briefly on some secondary applications that your particular schools might use, such as the College Scholarship Service Profile app. We will talk a little bit about institutional scholarships and grants, private scholarships and grants. We will talk about reviewing changes in a changing financial situation in a home, and also the award notification. Some of the terms we use in financial aid become commonplace to financial aid administrators, so I wanted to give you a little overview of what some of those things entail. For example, there are two groupings of aid that come into play in discussing financial aid opportunities for families. One is the term gift aid. This is money that does not need to be repaid. It takes the form of a grant or a scholarship and usually is a direct credit on the student's bill. Again, it does not have to be repaid. It's basically a discount against the expenses of college. The second group of financial aid tools would be loans. This is money that does have to be repaid at some point. In most cases, these loans do not have to begin to be repaid until after the student completes their degree program. It can be in the form of a federal subsidized or unsubsidized loan, which we will discuss shortly. And also there are loans out there in the private sector that you may not be aware of. Another important term that we discuss a lot is cost of attendance. Now, the cost of attendance entails a lot of different things, or involves a lot of different things. It includes tuition and fees, books and supplies, room and board, whether the student is living in residence halls on campus, an apartment off campus, or living at home with their parent or parents. We also include an amount for transportation for those who are traveling during semester breaks or for those who commute daily from their home. And then finally, miscellaneous expenses, which all students incur for one reason or another. Another term that we also look at is the expected family contribution. Now, this is the resulting number from the calculation used with the FAFSA data. So when the FAFSA is completed, we apply a formula to it, or the federal government applies a formula to it called federal methodology. That application determines how much the family can contribute to this student's college expenses for this 1 year. The FAFSA must be reapplied for on an annual basis, as things could change over that time. So that resulting number is called the expected family contribution, or EFC. So when a family is asking how much need they have, or when an administrator, financial aid administrator, discusses the situation and says you have a very high need or you have no need, this is what they're referring to. The definition of need is the cost of attendance, all the components that make up the costs to go to school, minus the expected family contribution. And that gives us the financial need. So if a student is a resident student, their cost of attendance is going to include room and board living on campus. So it stands to reason that that cost of attendance will be higher than the cost of attendance for a student who is living at home with their parents, who live there and do not have to pay for meals and housing. So you could have a student with 2 different costs of attendance at the same school depending on which type of a living arrangement they choose. The expected family contribution should remain the same regardless of what the cost of attendance is, because the expected family contribution is based on the family's current financial situation. So that number is always going to stay the same. So the financial need will vary depending on what the cost of attendance is. You may find that you apply for school and decide to be a resident student and get a very large financial aid package because you have a high financial need, and then decide that you would prefer to be a commuter and commute from home to save money, only to find that your financial aid gets reduced. This is because the cost of attendance has changed, not your ability to pay through the expected family contribution. Here we have a general timetable for students who are looking to begin college in the fall of 2022. The FAFSA will be available anytime after October 1st of 2021. It will be available online, and students and families can begin to complete the information and submit it on October 1st of 2021 and beyond. Within 2 weeks, colleges will start receiving the data, and they can begin to act on it at that time or choose their own timetable depending on how they process their aid. We have a variable situation in when colleges will begin to send out award letters, again because of not knowing what schools will choose as a deadline date for starting financial aid awards, etc. And all families are expected to make a decision by May 1st of 2022, which is the National Candidates Reply Date. And all schools in the country utilize this date so that they can begin to make decisions on how many sections of freshman English they need, or how many dorm rooms they need for freshmen, etc. So these are the guidelines that you want to follow. Now, you may want to contact the schools that you're interested in to find out if they have a specific drop-dead deadline date, because though most of us will be starting to accept FAFSA information after October 1st, some schools might wait until late November and do a big mailing of their financial aid awards for everybody who filed from October 1st on, who has been accepted to the college. Other schools might say, we're going to award financial aid to the people who filed the first week of October 1st, then the second week of October, then the third, etc. So check with the various schools that your student is interested in to see if they have any specific dates. So let's talk a little bit about this FAFSA. The FAFSA is the recognized application for all federal loans, grants, and the Federal Work-Study Program. In order to apply for any of those types of federal programs, the student must complete a FAFSA. The school has to use that information in determining the student's eligibility for federal programs. Now, many schools also use that information to determine how much of their own money they're going to award, because it's a convenient way to gather information and to fairly and equally review students at the same time. In order to file the FAFSA, you need to go to studentaid.gov or the old website information, fafsa.gov, which will also take you right to studentaid.gov. Now, I talked a little bit about the expected family contribution. This is what some of the things that comprise the expected family contribution. The parental contribution based on the family or the parent's household income in 2020 and their current assets. The student's contribution is comprised of the student's total income in 2020 and their current assets. We also review the current household size for the upcoming school year and the number of family members attending college. You'll notice that it says 2020 because that is, at the time that you complete the FAFSA, 2020 would be the last fully completed year before you finish, before you're able to complete the FAFSA. So this gives you the ability to look at a full year of complete information, and more than likely you have your taxes done at that time. So that makes it very easy for you to take that income from 2020 and put it right on the FAFSA. Once the FAFSA information is received and it runs through the federal methodology formula, it will create a response document called the Student Aid Report that you as a family will have access to. It will spit out all the information that you put in there so you can check it and make sure you've done everything correctly. It will determine eligibility for all federal aid programs, and as I said, also for institutional funding. And it is also the required first form for New York State's TAP program. You begin the process by completing the FAFSA, and then there are additional information pieces that are required for New York State based on your New York State net taxable income in 2020. So remember, you're completing the FAFSA after October of the student's senior year of high school. And most colleges set their own deadline dates. That's specifically if we have any junior parents in the audience. Before starting the FAFSA, however, you must complete an application to get a PIN number, now called the Federal Student Aid ID or FSA ID. This will serve as the student's signature electronically on the FAFSA, and also the parents. The parent must have one of their own, and the student must have one of their own. That has to have a unique username and password. They need to be separate from the parents. They need to also use separate email addresses. You can't use the same email address for both the parent and the student. The FAFSA, or the FSA ID will be used as your signature upon completing the FAFSA, so that it would be the same as if you physically wrote your signature on the FAFSA. That will allow it to be processed. It's also used a million other times for a variety of other things, including making corrections, applying for loans, etc. So this FSA ID is very important. So when you're completing the FAFSA, the assumption is that most students just leaving high school are considered dependent students, meaning that they must use their parental information on the FAFSA. So who are considered the parents? Well, the first grouping would be either the biological or adoptive parents, regardless of gender, whether they are married or unmarried but living together, or the widowed or single parent that the student lives with. So it's pretty basic. Whoever the student lives with, their current marital status and their current situation. If the parents are either separated or divorced, whichever parent the student lives with most in the past 12 months is the parent who should be completing the FAFSA. If the time between those two parents is split equally, then you would use the information of the parent who provides more financial support over the last 12 months. But the first kicker is who they live with most. If that custodial parent has remarried, then it is necessary to use the information about the parent and the step-parent. So even if there is a document that states that the step-parent does not need to contribute to college expenses for this student, they still must include their income and assets on the FAFSA to determine what that student is eligible for. The only information of the student's biological parent who no longer lives with them would be any child support that biological parent provides to the household for any children that live there. who wouldn't be considered the parent? These are situations where sometimes they're easy and sometimes they require a little bit more assistance from a financial aid administrator. So if the student is in foster care and they are not to use the foster parent's information, they are considered independent students, and they will be asked in many cases to provide documentation that they are in foster care, which means the only information that goes on the FAFSA for that student is the information of the student. Household size of 1, no income or very little income, etc. If the student is under legal guardianship, and that is documented legal guardianship through the courts, and these legal guardians have not adopted the student, then again, the student is not a dependent student any longer. They are independent, and they only put their own information on the FAFSA, household size of 1, etc. If the student is living with any other relatives who are not their parents, such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, older siblings, again, those people do not put their information on the FAFSA. If the student is living with someone such as a grandparent or an aunt or uncle, that student needs to provide documentation that their parents are not in the picture anywhere and that they are independent. So this usually requires some further documentation from the student to prove that they are independent. The student cannot simply list the income of their grandparents and say, well, that's my mother and father, because that is not the case. They very likely will be independent if they can provide documentation. And finally, the last case is very limited, but if a student's parent lives with a parent and the parent remarried and their biological parent is deceased and their other biological parent is no longer around, then that step-parent is now no longer responsible for filling out the FAFSA for the student, even though he or she was married to the student's parent. You would simply make that student independent. If there is a surviving biological parent, that parent's information must be used. So when you go to the FAFSA website, this is the screen you will see. This is FAFSA on the web, or FOTW, and it will ask you if you're new to the process or if you are a returning user. The reason that the returning user is separated out is because it will be used if you do any corrections to the FAFSA at a later date, or you add another school to the FAFSA so that they can get the information, or if you'd like to just view your student aid report that I mentioned earlier. The FAFSA will allow a student to list up to 10 schools when they complete the FAFSA for the first time. It is not necessary that they are accepted by all 10 schools. There will be some timing issues here. You're applying for admission at the same time you're completing financial aid applications. So you would want to list any school you're interested on the FAFSA while you are also applying for admission to those schools. Once you have been accepted to the school, then that school will then have access to your FAFSA information and be able to provide you with a financial aid package, financial aid award. Now, in the event that you have not quite narrowed things down to 10 schools, perhaps there are 12 schools that the student's interested in, our recommendation is that you complete the FAFSA with the 10 most likely choices. Make sure all of the schools that are on there have access to your information. In other words, that you've been accepted to all of them and they can see that they have the FAFSA available to them. And then once you confirm that they have received it, you can take 2 of the schools, usually at the bottom, take 2 of them off and add 2 new schools. But you want to verify that the school has access to your information before you remove them. One of the nice things that the federal government did a couple years ago is it made things a little bit easier for families who have difficulty looking at their tax returns to determine what actually goes on the FAFSA. And we are, when you're filling out the FAFSA for this 2022-23 year, you're a considerable distance past when the tax returns would have been filed for 2020. So more than likely, the tax return is out there in the IRS database. So this enables you to use this IRS data retrieval tool to leave the FAFSA and go to the IRS website, give the IRS permission to let you take that information from your tax returns and drop it into the FAFSA. Once they identify that you are the taxpayer that is requesting that information in that transmission there, then the IRS sends that information to the new window and it drops into your FAFSA. The advantage to this is that if your student's file is selected for verification, and many students are for a variety of reasons, just, for quality control and a bunch of other reasons. But if your student has been accepted or has been requested to complete verification, using the IRS data retrieval tool will allow the student to have the correct information right in the FAFSA and won't require them then perhaps to submit a tax return or a copy of a tax return or a verified tax return. It will already be there and out in the system and make things a little bit more helpful for the student and may move things along a little more quickly. There are some instances where families cannot use the IRS data retrieval tool, situations where they don't file electronically, or they've been remarried, or there's a change in the marital status, etc. So there are some rare cases where families are not able to use the data retrieval tool. But if you can, it's a great way to make sure that you get everything done and in the system as quickly as possible. The other thing that's really a good thing about this is that there is a video out on YouTube that if you just type in IRS data retrieval tool, it will give you a quick review of what you need to do in order to make sure that you've done the IRS data retrieval tool correctly. It's not ours, it's not from Canisius College, it's just simply out there that somebody posted as a helpful tool. So upon submitting all the information that is asked of you, you will receive a FAFSA confirmation page, and this says, "Yay, you've done everything you're supposed to and the FAFSA is complete." And it will give you some pieces of information that will be informational. They may not necessarily give you the full picture of what your financial aid award will be, but it will give you some information. I'm going to skip the state link in just a minute, or for just a moment, and go down to the bottom of the FAFSA. The EFC is listed on the left bottom side of the FAFSA, or of this confirmation page, to let you know what your expected family contribution is. Remember that the expected family contribution, or EFC, is not what you will pay for college. It's what the federal government believes you can afford to pay for college. In some instances, your student may get a substantial amount of aid because they are bright and they won a scholarship or something along those lines, and they might actually get more aid than they're financially eligible for because of scholarship situations. There are also cases where a family is very needy and there just isn't enough aid to meet their full need. So that does happen as well, but that's what that expected family contribution is there for, just to give you an idea. To the right of that, you will see federal aid estimates. Now, there are only a couple of federal aid programs that the federal government can estimate here. One being PELL, because it's directly tied to the EFC, and PELL is the largest grant program in the federal government's processing. The other thing that they can estimate is your eligibility for loans, and that's based on your year in college and whether you are, it can tell you the total amount of loan you can get, which as a freshman is only $5,500. That's all they can estimate. They can't estimate how much the college is going to give you out of its own money or out of other federal or state programs they have within their purview. So that isn't actually complete, it's just some generic information. At the top of the page, on the top left, you'll see a state aid link. Once you've completed the FAFSA, if you will click here, if you have at least one New York State school listed on the FAFSA, and you click here, it will take you to the New York State page for TAP, and you'll be able to complete the other required items that are necessary for New York State. Other states use this information as well, so it will depend on where you live what state pops up. This particular example shows Iowa State, so this student must have been living in Iowa. So if you are a resident of New York and you have a New York State school listed, click on this link and it will take you to the TAP pages so you can complete the rest of the process. If you miss this link, which tons of families do, you should wait about 5 or 6 business days, and then I will give you the information a little later in my presentation for the web address that you can go right to the New York State page and complete what you missed here. The reason you can't do it immediately is because once you close this, the portal that has been open is going to close. It will allow the federal government to send your income information to the state, and then once it gets there, it's there, and there's a shell of information there to which you will add additional information. So here's some common errors that occur when families fill out the FAFSA. First of all, make sure that you check your Social Security number. Pull out your Social Security card and make sure you're not transposing numbers, or that you're not putting down child number 2 instead of child number 1. Make sure you have the information correct. And remember, certain sections of the FAFSA are parent information and certain sections are student information. You always want to make sure that you're looking at the right section and that you're putting the right information in the right section. The inclusion of divorced or remarried parents, sometimes that can get messed up. If you are unclear, you can always check with a financial aid administrator as to how to proceed. Sometimes people also put the wrong information in for step-parents and parents, that kind of thing. Untaxed income is a common error. There are some forms of untaxed income that do not have to be included on the FAFSA. For example, any untaxed Social Security number, Social Security income that is received in the family, does not have to be put on the FAFSA, nor does income from public assistance, and a variety of other things. Another common error is the U.S. income taxes paid. This is not the number of what is withheld and shows up on your W-2 form. This is what you actually pay. Sometimes you have to pay extra on top of what was withheld, and sometimes you pay less. So if they withheld $1,000 and you're going to get a refund of $200, then your taxes paid isn't $1,000, it's only $800. So that's something to look for. And this is where the IRS data retrieval can come in handy, because it picks up that income or that taxes paid information correctly. Also, the household size should only be the student, the parents, and any siblings for whom the parents provide more than 50% of the support. If there is an extenuating circumstance, such as an extended family member like a grandparent or someone else, it's best to check with someone to make sure that you can include them in your household size. And then the net worth of real estate and investments. This is current value of real estate other than your home. It does not include your home. And investments other than traditional retirement accounts. You do not have to put the value of your retirement accounts nor your home value on the FAFSA. So some of the federal student aid programs that you may be offered by completing the FAFSA are these. I mentioned the federal Pell Grant, which is the largest federal grant program designed to help low-income families. eligible students are undergraduates who are going for their first undergraduate or bachelor's degree. And the maximum award for this year was $6,495. It's a sliding scale down depending on income. I'm sure it will go up for next year, for 2022-23. We just don't know what that figure is at this time. Completing the FAFSA is sufficient for application for this grant. Earlier I mentioned the category of loans. There is one type of federal direct loan, or it's called the Stafford loan. Two variances of it, but the major one is the direct Stafford loan, which is for undergraduates who demonstrate financial need. I'd already discussed what constitutes the term need. The interest on these loans is paid by the federal government while students are attending college, and the interest rate on these loans is set every July 1st for that year. So whatever the interest rate is that's set will come into play once the student goes into repayment, which is 6 months after graduation. So basically there is no interest accruing on subsidized loans until 6 months after graduation. For the unsubsidized loans, this is the federal government's way of allowing students and families to borrow more money in the student's name without a cosigner, but there is interest accruing while the student's in school. For undergraduate students, it will have the same interest rate as your subsidized loan, and it will accrue while the student's in school, but you again can defer payment of both principal and interest until the student 6 months after the student graduates. Some families choose to pay the interest while the student's in school, and they do that. It gives them an opportunity not to have that interest rolled into interest bearing numbers. So that's something that you may want to consider, and more information will be available to you as you go through the process about that. There are limits to how much students can borrow under these Stafford loan programs. For the students who are freshmen, so in most schools it's up to 24 credits or up to 30 credits depending on what they consider a freshman level. The most students can get is $5,500 total. The max is $3,500 on the subsidized loan and $2,000 on the unsubsidized. In the second year, they have the ability to take another $1,000 in subsidized if they're eligible for it, so $6,500 total. And then the following year it goes up to $5,500 sub and $2,000 unsub. The current interest rate for undergraduates is 3.73%. Again, it is reviewed on it is reviewed and changed every July 1st. It's based on the T-bill rate plus a percentage, so it's not an arbitrary figure. Repayment periods can go anywhere from the standard 10 years to up to 30 years, depending on which repayment plan the family and the student choose. And there are a variety of them now, which you will learn more about as you go through this process. And there are opportunities to defer repayment. If a student goes on to graduate school, they will continue to incur interest, but they don't necessarily have to begin to pay principal back until after they graduate from their graduate program, as long as they're at least half-time. And there are some cancellation options and forgiveness options for students that end up in certain fields. Again, students do have to go through a program or a website once they decide to take a loan that will explain some of this information, and then they'll do it again before they graduate from college. The next program that I'd like to talk about is the Federal Work-Study Program. Now, most students want to find a job, or at least their parents want them to find a job while they're in college. But not every student qualifies for federal work-study. Federal work-study is based upon financial need. So again, the FAFSA must be filed, and the student must have room in their financial aid award for a school to offer them an opportunity to work under the federal work-study program. Most students work at the college itself. They can do some off-campus work for public agencies or federal and state governments or certain nonprofit or organizations, depending on what the college has set up. They are paid minimum wage, and at least minimum wage, and they have to be paid at least monthly. Most schools give the checks directly to the students, so if they're going to use it towards their bill, they have to physically put it on their bill. Some things you want to ask about when you're accepting a work-study opportunity. Does the college guarantee a work-study job? If your child is offered it, will they get a job? And does the college require an interview process? Does the student have to have a resume, etc.? That kind of thing. The final loan program through the federal government is the Direct Plus loan, which many of you might remember the old PLUS loan or parent loan. That's what this is, except it goes directly through the federal government now. Unlike the subsidized and unsubsidized undergraduate loans, this loan requires a credit check. So the parent is the borrower and must undergo a credit check. And the annual limit for the loan is the cost of attendance minus all other financial aid. The current interest rate right now that was set this past July is 6.28%. And it is deferrable until the student graduates, or the parents can make payments as they go. That's entirely up to the family. They can choose either or option. Okay. For New York State financial aid programs, we are looking at the Tuition Assistance Program, which is the largest grant program in the state. And that is, that's TAP that you hear about. And then also a supplemental program called Enhanced Tuition Assistance, or ETA, for private institutions, and the EXCELSIOR Scholarship for state institutions. For New York State TAP, again, the student must file the FAFSA first, and then if they either connect with the connection at the end of the FAFSA, they can finish filling out the TAP information there, or if they miss that, they can go back in at a later time, about a week or so. And the website that you need to complete the TAP application is at the bottom of this slide. It's hesc.ny.gov/TAP. And that's where the student needs to go to apply for it. Now, students will be asked to create a PIN at this site as well. It is different than the PIN they use for the FAFSA. However, they can use the same one if they want to, but it is a different situation, so they need to keep track of these numbers separately. TAP is a college-specific program, meaning that the TAP award at a state school or community college could be less, or should probably be less, than most private institutions, simply because the tuition is different at those schools. There was a significant increase in TAP this year. The highest award went from $51.65 to $56.65. That's the first increase in TAP we've had in quite some time. The amount is based on the 2020 New York State net taxable income, not the federal AGI, but the New York State net taxable income. And just to give you an example, if your net taxable income exceeds $80,000 in 2020, you will be ineligible for a TAP award. If it's between $50,000 and $80,000, it more than likely will be about $500 a year. And then there is a sliding scale of income down to the maximum award of $56.65. I already discussed how to go about and apply this. Now, on the FAFSA, you will list up to 10 schools. Whichever is the first New York State school that is listed on your FAFSA will be transferred over to New York State, and that will be the school of record on your TAP. That doesn't mean that every school is unable to give you an estimate of your TAP award. We will all be able to give you an estimate of your TAP award. However, once you make a decision on which school in New York State your student will be attending, then you will go back to the New York State website and make sure that you have the proper school in there, and if not, change it so that the money goes to the correct institution. For enhanced TAP and the Excelsior, the award is a maximum of $6,000 per year minus the TAP amount. There are income, residency, and academic requirements that are available to you on the New York State website. The same site you go to for TAP. There is an application there for enhanced TAP and for Excelsior. The enhanced TAP, which is only for private institutions, does require a financial contribution from the school, and so not every school participates in enhanced TAP. The Excelsior Scholarship is the name of the New York State or SUNY and CUNY school versions of this particular award. Remember, it only has to do with tuition, not room and board, books and supplies, that kind of thing. In the event that there is a limited amount of money, returning students have the first opportunity to receive money in future years. The maximum a student can receive it is for 4 years, but if you have a adjusted gross income, I know I just said that state programs rely on the New York State net taxable, but for this program, they look at AGI, the combination of the student and the parent. If they exceed $125,000, then you would not be eligible financially for these programs. If it's below that, then you might want to go through the process of completing the application. Usually the applications are not available until the spring of the senior year, but feel free to check the New York State site to be sure that they have them earlier. In previous years, they have left students the ability to leave their email address to be notified when the application is available. I mentioned these requirements before. The only other requirement is that after graduation, the student must live and work in New York State for the same number of years they receive this award. So if they receive the 4 years, they can leave the state to go to graduate school if they need to or if they want to. But after that, they must live and work in New York State for at least, I believe it's 4 of the next 8 years. Now, some schools find that the information on the FAFSA is not sufficient. They want you to complete another type of form that can provide them even more information than the FAFSA. They must use the FAFSA information to determine your eligibility for federal aid, but for any of their own money, they can use any other type of information. So some of them use the College Scholarship Service CSS profile. It's offered through the College Board, and you would want to find out if your school is going to use this before you go ahead and fill out an application, because it does incur a cost, and you don't want to fill it out if it's unnecessary. It's not going to get you any further if the school doesn't use it. So there are approximately 240 schools in the country who use it. They're mostly private schools, pretty much, and they use this online application. It's all online. You complete the application saying that you would like to complete a CSS profile, and it's $25 for the very first school that is going to receive it, and then $16 for each school after that. So they will take your information and your money and send you a list of questions that those schools that you are applying to would like you to answer. You fill them out electronically and send them back to CSS, and then CSS forwards them on to those institutions that want that information, and they use that in the calculation of their own, determination of their own money for grants, scholarships, etc. Some colleges might want to collect some extra money or extra information from you, but they don't want you to have to pay a fee. So they might put one online, put an application online for institutional aid, or they might have specific scholarship applications, and they'll ask you to complete those. So be sure that you ask about that at your interviews with admissions folks, etc. Now, as far as institutional scholarships go, some institutional scholarships are determined strictly on the basis of your high school performance and your SAT scores, or sometimes one or the other, whichever is better. Those are usually called academic merit scholarships. There are also scholarships for talent-based performance, such as art, music. You can name a variety of different topics where a scholarship might be offered. Some of these might require an additional application. So you need to check with the school, check their website, find out if there are scholarships that you might be eligible for that you need to complete an additional application. The scholarship letter that you receive, if you've been awarded one of these, should clearly indicate how the scholarship is determined renewable, if it is renewable. What is the specific award amount? Are there probationary opportunities if you have, a poor semester? Do you need to live in campus housing, or can you live at home? All of those things can have an impact on eligibility for scholarships. Different schools also offer grants for families who have financial need. And usually a grant has a need component as opposed to a scholarship, which is a merit component. That's not to say that really bright students don't qualify for grants, but often with scholarships there isn't a need component involved. There is a grant component, or there is an academic component involved. Various grants offered by colleges might be done annually. They might be able to be renewed on an annual basis. They will require, many times, they will require that you complete the FAFSA every year by a certain date. Again, you need to know all those things to plan ahead for your second, third, and fourth years. And for those students with athletic ability, these are awarded for athletic ability at your high school level. You may contact the coaches at the various colleges that you are interested in. They have limited ability to contact you except for certain times. Most schools in Western New York have very strong athletic departments, and they know the rules of the NCAA rules for contact with athletes, etc. And they usually are able to guide their students very well in what's necessary to be considered for an athletic scholarship. You also should consider private scholarships. There are many, many organizations out there, places where parents work, places where parents socialize, organizations that parents belong to or students might have worked at. These are usually given on an annual basis. Sometimes a scholarship is offered based on writing an essay. And sometimes you can use the essay for several different scholarship applications. So I would certainly recommend you talk to family and friends about those types of scholarships and see if there are monies out there that it might be available to you. Just remember that we have to count those into your financial aid award to make sure that you don't exceed your financial need and that you don't exceed your cost of attendance. I mentioned earlier that we're federal loans, but many of you are not aware of the variety of lending institutions that are now participating in providing loans to families to supplement all the other types of aid they receive. In most private loans, the student is the borrower requiring a cosigner. They do require a credit check of both the student and the cosigner. Now, the student doesn't necessarily have to have an established credit history, but they cannot have an adverse credit history. The cosigner is the one whose credit history they look at more stringently. The private loans are available to families in the same way a PLUS loan would be, in that it's the cost of attendance minus all other financial aid would determine how much money the student could borrow. The interest rates will vary from lender to lender depending upon credit worthiness. There are deferment opportunities for a variety of different lenders. Some of them will give you benefits on the back end, where if you are in repayment and you pay them back 4 years in a row with no missed payments or a direct debit payment from your savings or checking account, they will release the co-borrower from responsibility, etc. This ElmSelect website, elmselect.com, is a platform that Canisius uses to direct our students to do research on lenders that are out there that we have seen or process loans for. There are a variety of them. Some of them are names you might be familiar with, and some of them might be names that you might do banking with, such as Discover, etc. But there are a variety of lending institutions out there now that don't do anything but education lending, and you may not be familiar with their name. And if you have good credit, you might find that you get a very good interest rate there. Now, in the era, well, even before the pandemic, but especially during the era of the pandemic, we know that there are going to be circumstances that are changing or have changed in families' income, their financial stability, etc. The federal government does not allow you to put those things on the FAFSA, but a financial aid administrator has the ability to go in and review documentable information and make changes to the FAFSA depending upon changes in your circumstance. So that would be such things as changes in employment status, unusual medical expenses that are not covered by insurance, changes in a parent's marital status, unusual dependent care benefits. For example, you have a child with special needs. The student unable to obtain parental information. This is very similar to our discussion earlier about who can file the FAFSA and who cannot. Any student that has a rift with their parent and is unable to get information should definitely talk to a financial aid administrator to determine what process can be followed to see if they can get aid without that parent. Any of these circumstances should be reported to the financial aid office at the schools your child is looking at. You should file the FAFSA first and then let them know about these kind of situations. A school has discretion in whether it takes any of these into account or not. So just because school A does a review and changes the information on the FAFSA because of unusual medical expenses, another school may choose not to do that. There is no recourse on your part. This is strictly determined by the college's policy. So you'd want to reach out to each school individually, provide whatever documentation is necessary, and then hopefully you would be able to see some change in your financial aid package because of that. As I said, you cannot put this information on the FAFSA. You should do it in writing or by email. Provide whatever documentation is necessary, and do it in a timely manner so that the school can make a decision before you need to make a decision on whether you can afford to attend that school or not. And finally, when you get the award notification from the school, some schools send them out all electronically, so make sure that your students are watching their email. Read it carefully. Make sure that you understand that one financial aid award letter might show 3 or 4 types of financial aid and then a huge parent loan, where another one might show the parent loan completely outside of the financial aid package. So one appears to be inflated and the other one is not. You need to watch that. Follow instructions and meet all deadlines. Whatever the deadlines are, follow through. If you're not sure how to do it, ask. If any additional forms are required, you'll want to do that as soon as you can so that you can be sure that your financial aid award is set in stone and that you don't find out in August that the award that you thought you had is completely wrong because you made an error. And always keep the student in the loop. Make sure the student is aware of what is necessary to complete all this, and that whatever pieces of the puzzle are required of the student, that they do it. For example, when a student takes a federal loan, they have to complete a promissory note, and they have to go through a brief entrance counseling on the federal government's website. This is not something you as parents should be doing. Your child should be doing this with your assistance. Certainly sit with them and go through it with them to make sure that it's complete, but have them accept the responsibility that is necessary. They're no longer going to be in high school, and they're going to be away from home and far away from you, so you want them to know what they're talking about. If you have any questions, here is the financial aid contact information. And you can reach me at this number and just ask for Michelle Rizzo. We also have our graduate admissions number on here if anyone has questions in particular about admissions to Canisius or about just the admissions process in general. I'm sure they would answer any questions you have about that. Your guidance office also has my email address. If you wish to reach out to me with any questions you may have, I would be more than happy to discuss those with you. I thank you, I wish you good luck, and I know that there are people here that are willing to help you if you need it, and I hope this helps to make the process just a little bit easier. Thank you.